In the history of how nations die, there is usually the sound of cannon fire, the marching of boots, or the screaming of shells. Yet, in the 19th century, the greatest empire of the Middle East met its demise, not at the hands of soldiers, but at the pen of accountants. The Ottoman Empire, once a terrifying superpower that had dominated Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa for centuries, was slowly suffocated by the financial machinery of London and Paris. The conquest was subtle, invisible to the eye of the ordinary observer, executed not with gunpowder, but with compound interest. This was the story of the first true debt trap in modern history, an intricate web of loans, interest, and fiscal dependency that would slowly strip the empire of sovereignty and wealth. To understand this tragic unraveling, one must look at the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century. To the outside world, it still appeared as a titan, stretching from the Balkans across the mountains of Anatolia to the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina and beyond into the deserts of North Africa. The empire seemed unassailable. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions of subjects and presided on a throne at the crossroads of the world, a seat of power whose prestige was unmatched. However, beneath the surface of grandeur, the foundations of the empire were rotting. Economically, the Ottoman Empire was profoundly sick. While Britain and France were in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, building railways, factories, and steam-powered machinery, the Ottoman economy remained largely medieval and agrarian. Its population consisted mostly of peasants and craftsmen, struggling to survive in a world increasingly defined by mechanized production. The treasury of the Sultan was chronically short of cash, a problem compounded by an archaic tax system riddled with corruption. Local officials, acting as intermediaries, often diverted half of the collected revenue before it ever reached Istanbul. For centuries, the Ottomans had attempted to remedy fiscal shortages through traditional methods such as debasing currency or confiscating wealth from affluent officials. These measures had sufficed in a pre-industrial world, but in the modern era, they were insufficient. The empire required capital not only to maintain itself, but to survive geopolitical threats. It needed funds to modernize its army against the encroaching Russian Empire, to build roads, telegraphs, and other infrastructure, and to present itself as a modern state on the European stage. For a long period, Ottoman rulers had resisted the temptation of borrowing from European powers. Deep cultural and religious aversion to usury, combined with a political fear of dependence on Christian nations, made foreign loans a last resort. This stance changed abruptly in 1853, when the Russian Empire invaded Ottoman territory, initiating the Crimean War. The conflict was beyond the financial capabilities of the empire, and Britain and France, wary of Russian expansion, intervened. While their armies and fleets helped fight Russia, they also sent bankers. The Ottoman treasury, facing unprecedented wartime expenditures, was pressed to pay soldiers, arm cannons, and provision ships. Sultan Abdülmecid I found himself cornered and was advised that the only way to save the empire was to borrow money from Europe. In 1854, the Ottomans signed their first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers. The loan was presented as a lifeline, an act of solidarity from allies, but in reality, it marked the first step into a financial trap. The terms were harsh. For every 100 units of debt, the Sultan received only 80 in cash, the remainder kept as commissions and risk premiums, while interest had to be paid on the full amount. Though the cash that did arrive provided temporary relief and enabled the empire to sustain its war effort, it came with a heavy price. The Ottomans were effectively paying interest on money they never possessed, a foundational error that would echo through decades of economic mismanagement. The end of the Crimean War in 1856 brought relief, but not financial reprieve. The Sultan and his elite had tasted the allure of easy credit and became enamored with its power. Observing the modern cities of London and Paris, the Ottoman rulers felt a deep sense of inadequacy and aspired to replicate the grandeur they saw abroad. Yet the borrowed funds were not invested in productive ventures such as factories, irrigation, or education. Instead, they were channeled into lavish displays of imperial prestige. The Dolmabahçe Palace, commissioned by Sultan Abdülmecid I, became the ultimate symbol of this extravagant spending. Constructed with imported crystal, gold leaf, silk carpets, and Italian marble, the palace consumed 5 million Ottoman gold liras, a sum equivalent to a quarter of the empire's entire annual tax revenue. While peasants in Anatolia struggled to extract subsistence from dry soil, the Sultan's treasury funneled wealth to architects, artisans, and foreign suppliers in Europe. This disconnect between expenditure and productive investment not only drained the state's coffers, but also entrenched financial dependency on foreign creditors. Following Abdülmecid I, Sultan Abdulaziz continued the pattern of lavish spending while simultaneously attempting to modernize military capabilities. Obsessed with replicating the naval might of Britain, he commissioned ironclad warships from British shipyards and procured advanced artillery from Germany. On paper, the Ottoman navy became the third largest in the world. Yet the empire could not afford to maintain fuel or properly supply these vessels. They sat in the Golden Horn, rusting monuments to financial overreach. To cover debts, the empire increasingly relied on short-term loans from local financiers, particularly the Greek and Armenian banking families in the Galata district of Istanbul. These lenders charged exorbitant interest rates, sometimes reaching 20% or more, creating a cycle of dependency that bordered on financial suicide. By the 1860s, the empire had entered a classic Ponzi scheme scenario, borrowing anew to pay interest on old loans. Debt payments consumed an ever-growing portion of the state's revenue, leaving scant resources for the army, navy, schools, or infrastructure. By the early 1870s, the financial structure of the Ottoman Empire had become unsustainable. The empire's income, largely dependent on agriculture and traditional taxes, could no longer cover the growing interest payments on foreign loans. By 1860, roughly 15% of the Ottoman budget was being used to service debt. And by 1870, that figure had soared to over 50%. This meant that half of every coin collected from a Greek fisherman or a Syrian farmer was instantly leaving the country to pay a bondholder in London or Paris. The remaining revenue had to stretch across a vast empire, funding the army, maintaining the administration, and paying for imperial courts. Public services, infrastructure projects, and industrial investment were virtually non-existent. The state was hollowed out, consumed from within by the relentless demands of foreign creditors. To manage this precarious financial situation, the Ottoman government turned to local financiers known as the Galata Bankers, predominantly Greek and Armenian families. These bankers operated in Istanbul's Galata district and became the empire's emergency lenders. When the treasury ran dry, the Grand Vizier would approach these bankers for short-term loans, often at crippling interest rates of 18% to 20% or higher. While this temporarily filled gaps in cash flow, it intensified the empire's dependency, as each new loan further deepened the cycle of debt. Sultan Abdulaziz, who succeeded Abdülmecid I, compounded the problem through his love of military hardware and naval expansion. Obsessed with matching the power of European navies, he commissioned ironclads from Britain and advanced artillery from Germany. Though the Ottoman navy ranked as the third largest in the world on paper, the empire lacked the resources to maintain fuel or properly staff the fleet. Ships rusted in the Golden Horn, becoming literal floating monuments to financial overreach. The tipping point came in 1873 with a global financial panic that originated in Vienna and triggered the Long Depression. European capital markets froze, and banks facing their own liquidity crises stopped lending. The Ottoman Empire, already heavily indebted, could no longer rely on external credit. At the same time, a catastrophic drought struck Anatolia in 1873 and 1874, devastating crops, killing livestock, and decimating the primary tax base. Villagers faced famine, and the state's revenue streams collapsed while debt obligations remained fixed. By the summer of 1875, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha realized that the empire faced an impossible situation. A massive debt payment was due in October, but the treasury was empty. Efforts to raise a new loan failed, as international markets had shut their doors to the sick man of Europe. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree, later known as the Decree of Ramadan, effectively having its debt payments. The state pledged to pay 50% in cash and the remaining 50% in government-issued paper, promising a 5% return. Diplomatically, it was called a moratorium. Financially, it was an outright default. The European reaction was immediate and furious. Millions of middle-class investors in Britain and France, who had purchased Ottoman bonds seeking high yields, lost their savings. Newspapers condemned the Ottomans as swindlers and thieves. The diplomatic support that had been extended to the empire during the Crimean War evaporated, leaving the Ottomans politically isolated. The financial weakness exposed the empire to renewed external threats. Seeing the fiscal collapse, the Russian Empire seized the opportunity to press its advantage. In 1877, Russia declared war, and the ensuing Russo-Turkish War was disastrous for the Ottomans. Underpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized, Ottoman troops fought valiantly, but ultimately faced a humiliating defeat. Russian forces reached the suburbs of Istanbul, and the empire was compelled to sign a peace treaty that ceded vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. Beyond territorial loss, the treaty imposed a crippling financial indemnity, adding hundreds of millions of francs in war debt to an already insolvent empire. The cumulative debt owed to British, French, and now Russian creditors far exceeded the Ottoman economy's total value. Sultan Abdülmecid II, who ascended to the throne during this chaos, found himself ruling over a nation effectively bankrupt and politically powerless. In 1881, European creditors enacted a more systematic approach to secure repayment. Representatives of bondholders from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria arrived in Istanbul not as generals, but as bankers armed with briefcases rather than swords. They negotiated directly with the Ottoman officials to take control of the empire's revenues. This negotiation resulted in the Decree of Muharrem, which created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, a unique instrument of financial imperialism. The OPDA was not part of the Ottoman government. It was an independent corporation managed by a board of directors representing European banks. Headquartered in a fortress-like building in Istanbul, the OPDA became the de facto authority over the empire's finances. It was granted control over the empire's most profitable sources of revenue, including taxes on silk, salt, spirits, tobacco, fishing, and legal documentation. The organization hired over 5,000 tax collectors who wore uniforms, carried weapons, and answered exclusively to the board of directors rather than the Sultan. Their presence across the empire, from the mountains of Macedonia to the coastal cities of Syria, ensured that wealth was siphoned efficiently from the local population to pay foreign creditors. The OPDA's administration, while ruthless, was remarkably effective. Unlike the Ottoman bureaucracy, it operated under European accounting standards, built warehouses, improved salt mines, and distributed disease-free silkworm eggs to farmers. Economic growth did occur, but it primarily benefited the creditors, not the citizens. By 1914, the OPDA collected roughly one-third of all Ottoman revenue, leaving the empire with only the remnants of its own wealth. With limited resources, the government could neither fund education nor industrial projects, nor could it modernize infrastructure. The state remained perpetually impoverished, trapped in a cycle of underdevelopment as foreign control dictated its financial and political priorities. The Sultan's sovereignty was severely compromised. Any initiative to build schools, roads, or other public works required approval from the OPDA, and often there was no money left. Furthermore, the debt trap allowed European powers to manipulate Ottoman foreign policy, shaping its alliances and diplomatic decisions. This financial subjugation created an opening for Germany, which sought a strategic foothold in the Middle East. While Britain and France were content to profit from Ottoman debt, Germany proposed the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, connecting Europe to the Persian Gulf and circumventing British-controlled routes such as the Suez Canal. The Ottoman government, desperate for modernization, accepted German financing, inadvertently swapping one cycle of foreign dependency for another. Deutsche Bank and German companies funded the railway, yet the terms were equally exploitative. Contracts guaranteed profits per mile of track and ceded mineral and oil rights along the railway to German firms. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was effectively a German economic colony. German officers trained the army, engineers operated infrastructure, and financial control shifted further from Istanbul. Meanwhile, the debt of the sick man of Europe continued to define its international relations and internal governance, demonstrating the profound consequences of financial dependency on national sovereignty. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had entered its final chapter as a declining imperial power. The financial dependency, established by the European creditors through the OPDA, had left the empire politically and economically weakened. The Young Turk movement, a coalition of reformist officers and intellectuals, rose to prominence with a vision of modernizing the state and reclaiming national sovereignty. They recognized that as long as the empire remained under the fiscal control of foreign powers, it could never truly be independent. The Young Turks pushed for constitutional reforms and sought to centralize authority, but their ambitions were limited by the overarching grip of debt and foreign oversight. Ottoman policy, both domestic and international, was constrained not only by internal weaknesses, but also by the unrelenting presence of European creditors who dictated the flow of revenue and influenced strategic decisions. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman leadership faced a difficult strategic choice. The empire had lost significant territory in the Balkans and faced a financially crippled state, yet Germany, through its economic and military involvement, offered a potential lifeline. The Young Turks concluded that aligning with Germany could provide the opportunity to escape the debt trap. They believed that a German victory might allow them to cancel debts owed to Britain and France and abolish the OPDA, thereby regaining financial and political independence. This calculation was higher risk, representing a gamble of everything or nothing. Upon entering the war, the Ottoman government took immediate steps to assert independence from European creditors. One of their first acts was to expel British and French directors from the OPDA headquarters in Istanbul and halt payments to London and Paris. For a brief moment, the empire experienced the illusion of financial freedom. Yet the gamble failed spectacularly. The war proved catastrophic for the Ottoman Empire, which, already weakened by decades of fiscal mismanagement and external control, could not sustain prolonged conflict. Its armies, though courageous, were underpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized. Critical infrastructure had deteriorated, and shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies plagued soldiers and civilians alike. As the war progressed, Ottoman territory was steadily eroded by advancing Allied forces. Key regions, including parts of the Middle East and the Caucasus, fell under foreign occupation. The empire's participation in World War I hastened its disintegration. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire had effectively collapsed. With its administrative apparatus in disarray, its population exhausted, and its political legitimacy eroded. Despite the empire's territorial demise, the financial obligations it had incurred persisted. European creditors remained determined to enforce repayment, and the debt, though largely symbolic during wartime, continued to define the terms of international relations for the successor state. In the aftermath of the war, the Ottoman Empire was formally dissolved. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a former military officer and national leader, spearheaded the Turkish War of Independence and successfully established the Republic of Turkey in 1923, despite the devastation of war and the enormity of rebuilding a nation from the ashes of a collapsed empire. The issue of Ottoman debt could not be ignored. At the Treaty of Lausanne, European powers insisted that the new Turkish Republic assume responsibility for the debts of the defunct empire. Their argument was rooted in the legal principle of state succession. The successor state inherits not only the territory, but also the financial obligations of its predecessor. Ataturk, pragmatic and determined to integrate Turkey into the global economy, reluctantly agreed to honor these debts. The terms of repayment were structured to acknowledge the impoverished state of the new republic. While payments were reduced and schedules extended, the principle remained. Turkey would pay the debts incurred by Ottoman sultans who had long passed. The new republic, battered by war, politically fragile, and economically depleted, spent decades servicing loans that were, in many ways, the consequence of the extravagant and short-sighted policies of the 19th century sultans. The financial obligation was immense. Yet Ataturk recognized that ignoring the debt would isolate Turkey from international trade and investment, further hampering the nation's recovery. The Ottoman debt saga illustrates the profound consequences of financial dependency on national sovereignty. Over the course of nearly a century, the empire had borrowed money to sustain military campaigns, build grandiose palaces, and construct infrastructure. But the borrowing was often for consumption rather than investment. Loans were obtained under predatory conditions with high effective interest rates, and repayment obligations exceeded the empire's capacity to generate revenue. European creditors, by maintaining strict control over revenue collection and administering funds through the OPDA, effectively dictated Ottoman policy without occupying its cities. This system of soft conquest demonstrated that control could be exerted, not only through military might, but also through financial leverage. Between 1854 and 1954, the Ottoman Empire and its successor, the Republic of Turkey, remained entangled in debt. The first foreign loans in the 1850s were merely the beginning of a long process that would culminate in payments spanning a full century. By the time the final installment was paid on May 25, 1954, it had taken exactly 100 years for Turkey to clear the debts incurred during the empire's financial decline. The long duration of repayment highlights the structural vulnerability created by excessive reliance on foreign credit. The empire had been able to borrow to fund its immediate needs, but the compounding interest, repeated loans, and diversion of funds toward prestige projects created a cycle of dependency that persisted far beyond the lifespan of individual rulers or even the empire itself. The story of the Ottoman debt trap offers enduring lessons on the interplay between finance, sovereignty, and national strategy. The sultans of the 19th century believed that they could purchase the appearance of modernity through foreign capital. Using wealth obtained from loans to emulate European grandeur, they did not fully appreciate that every loan represented a chain, every bond a tether to external powers. The British and French, who had provided loans under the guise of alliance and solidarity, did not need to occupy Istanbul militarily. By structuring repayment in a way that funneled wealth from the Ottoman population to European creditors, they achieved control without warfare. Over time, debt payments dictated both domestic policy and foreign alliances, reducing the empire to a state of quasi-colonial subordination. Germany's later involvement through projects like the Berlin-Baghdad Railway further illustrated the complexity of financial dependency. German loans and infrastructure projects extended foreign influence into the empire while offering the illusion of modernization. Contracts guaranteed returns for German companies and ceded valuable natural resources, effectively converting economic development into a tool of external control. By the eve of World War I, the Ottoman Empire had lost both autonomy and financial independence, demonstrating that the mechanisms of soft conquest can be as effective, if not more insidious, than traditional military occupation. Ultimately, the Ottoman Empire's decline was not the result of a single battle, a failed reform, or a succession crisis. It was a slow erosion of sovereignty orchestrated through financial instruments, compounded by mismanagement, war, and natural disasters. Even after the empire ceased to exist, the debts it accumulated continued to shape the policies and priorities of its successor state. The Ottoman Empire's experience underscores a central principle. True sovereignty extends beyond borders and armies to encompass control over finance and economic resources. Without such control, an empire may appear powerful, but it remains vulnerable to the quiet, inexorable force of debt. The Ottoman debt trap had profound and lasting effects on the empire's society, economy, and geopolitical standing. Beyond the immediate financial consequences, the siphoning of wealth and erosion of sovereignty reshaped Ottoman governance, social structure, and public confidence in the state. By the late 19th century, ordinary citizens bore the weight of a system designed to extract resources for foreign creditors rather than to sustain local development. Farmers and artisans, the backbone of the economy, faced increasingly oppressive taxation. Every bag of salt, every silk cocoon, every fish caught in the Bosphorus contributed directly to servicing the empire's external debt. Local communities were left impoverished, and the state's ability to invest in schools, infrastructure, and industrial development was severely curtailed. This chronic underinvestment stunted economic growth and contributed to persistent regional inequalities, particularly between the urban centers of Istanbul and the neglected provinces of Anatolia, Syria, and the Balkans. Cultural implications were equally profound. The sultans of the 19th century, especially Abdülmecid I and Abdulaziz, sought to emulate the grandeur of European capitals, commissioning opulent palaces, lavish public buildings, and ceremonial projects. Structures like the Dolmabahçe Palace symbolized imperial ambition, but they were financed almost entirely through loans. While visually impressive, these projects had little to no economic return and exacerbated the empire's fiscal fragility. They reflected a broader cultural orientation toward European models of prestige and modernity, often at odds with the practical needs of the empire's population. Ordinary citizens, struggling to survive on minimal agricultural yields, were largely excluded from these symbols of progress. The disconnect between imperial display and popular necessity fueled social discontent and eroded confidence in the ruling elite. Attempts at reform were constrained by the empire's financial subjugation. The Tanzimat reforms, beginning in 1839, aimed to modernize the Ottoman administrative and legal system, promote equality before the law, and stimulate economic growth. While the reforms succeeded in creating a more centralized and codified state structure, their implementation was limited by chronic fiscal shortages and foreign control over revenue streams. Without independent financial capacity, the state could not fully execute infrastructure projects, improve public services, or foster industrial development. The OPDA, while efficient in revenue collection, diverted resources away from local investment, leaving reformist ambitions incomplete. Moreover, the reliance on European loans created a structural tension. Any attempt to assert fiscal independence risked alienating creditors, while continued borrowing perpetuated dependency. This catch-22 stifled genuine economic and political autonomy. Geopolitically, the debt trap weakened the Ottoman Empire's ability to respond to external threats and navigate international relations. The empire had lost the ability to finance its military independently, leaving it vulnerable to both regional adversaries and European ambitions. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 exemplified this vulnerability. Although Ottoman forces displayed courage, they were underpaid, poorly equipped, and logistically unsupported. The war's outcome, which included territorial losses and heavy indemnities, further intensified the empire's dependency. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, foreign powers could exert influence without direct intervention. British, French, and German control over finance allowed them to shape Ottoman policy, prioritize their own economic interests, and dictate strategic alliances. Debt became a tool of geopolitical manipulation, demonstrating that financial instruments could substitute for military conquest in establishing influence over a sovereign state. The interplay between European creditors and Ottoman reforms illustrates the subtle mechanisms of economic imperialism. The British and French, through the OPDA, enforced efficient revenue collection while maintaining the empire's formal independence. They improved infrastructure and boosted production in areas like silk and salt, but the profits flowed abroad. Germany, entering later through projects like the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, leveraged infrastructure investment to secure control over strategic resources such as minerals and oil. While these interventions created pockets of modernization, they primarily served the interests of creditors rather than the Ottoman populace. The empire's dependence on foreign loans undermined attempts to build a sufficient modern economy, trapping it in a cycle of extraction and partial development that limited sovereignty, social cohesion, and strategic flexibility. Social consequences were equally severe. Tax collectors employed by the OPDA operated with strict enforcement, often ignoring local conditions. The pressure to meet revenue quotas led to widespread hardship, particularly in rural areas. Communities experienced famine, impoverishment, and social dislocation as resources were diverted abroad. This economic pressure contributed to internal unrest, regional revolts, and a growing sense of disenfranchisement among Ottoman subjects. Simultaneously, the concentration of wealth among the elite and foreign creditors accentuated inequality, further eroding loyalty to the state and diminishing the legitimacy of the Sultanate. Ordinary citizens saw the state as an instrument of extraction rather than protection, weakening the social contract and undermining long-term stability. The Ottoman debt experience provides enduring lessons for modern states. It illustrates that financial dependence can compromise sovereignty as profoundly as military occupation. Debt, when poorly managed or exploited by foreign powers, can limit a nation's ability to govern, invest in its population, and pursue independent foreign policy. The empire's reliance on loans for consumption and prestige rather than productive investment created structural vulnerabilities that persisted across generations, demonstrating that borrowing without a sustainable repayment strategy can have catastrophic consequences. It also underscores the importance of economic transparency, sound fiscal policy, and diversification of revenue streams. Dependence on a narrow tax base or external credit magnifies vulnerability to both market fluctuations and geopolitical pressure. Furthermore, the Ottoman example highlights the moral hazard inherent in creditor-debtor relationships. European banks assumed that governments would intervene to protect their financial interests, allowing them to lend aggressively despite the empire's precarious financial position. Similarly, the Ottoman sultans, observing the influx of easy credit, underestimated the long-term obligations of borrowing. The resulting cycle of loans to pay interest on prior debt mirrors modern financial crises, where short-term solutions can lead to long-term structural problems. Even after the empire's dissolution, the financial legacy of the debt trap persisted. The Republic of Turkey, emerging from war and ruin, inherited these obligations. Ataturk's decision to honor the debts, despite the economic hardship, reflects a pragmatic understanding of the international financial system. Repudiation could have led to isolation and reduced access to global markets. Turkey's century-long repayment of Ottoman loans demonstrates the long-term consequences of fiscal mismanagement and the enduring impact of foreign financial control on national development. In sum, the Ottoman debt trap was more than a financial crisis. It was a multidimensional phenomenon that shaped governance, society, and international relations. The extraction of resources through foreign loans undermined sovereignty, stifled economic modernization, and contributed to social inequality. Attempts at reform were constrained by structural dependence, leaving the empire vulnerable to internal unrest and external manipulation. Projects like lavish palaces and railways, while visually impressive or strategically significant, often served the interests of creditors rather than the people. The legacy of this period demonstrates that financial independence is integral to national sovereignty and long-term stability, and it provides a cautionary tale for modern states navigating the complex interplay of debt, diplomacy, and development. The Ottoman Empire's descent into financial dependency can be traced back to the mid-19th century, beginning with the empire's first major foreign loan in 1854. The Crimean War against Russia forced Sultan Abdülmecid I to seek capital from European bankers, breaking centuries of reluctance to borrow. This loan, provided by a consortium of British and French financiers, was deceptively structured. For every 100 Ottoman pounds borrowed, only 80 pounds reached Istanbul, while the remainder was kept as fees and commissions. The empire nonetheless agreed to pay interest on the full amount, creating a financial burden far greater than the apparent benefit of the loan. This initial agreement set the pattern for a century of dependence, establishing the principle that borrowing could offer short-term relief while producing long-term subjugation. Following the Crimean War, Ottoman rulers, intoxicated by the apparent power that European loans conferred, increasingly turned to foreign credit to fund both military campaigns and extravagant projects. Sultan Abdülmecid I, later Abdulaziz, channeled borrowed funds into the construction of the Dolmabahçe Palace, a monumental symbol of imperial prestige designed to rival European capitals. The palace, adorned with 14 tons of gold leaf, baccarat crystal staircases, silk carpets, and Italian marble walls, consumed a quarter of the empire's annual tax revenue. This pattern of spending on consumption rather than productive investment became a defining feature of Ottoman fiscal policy. The loans temporarily addressed immediate fiscal needs but failed to generate long-term revenue, creating a structural imbalance that would persist for decades. By the 1860s, the empire's debt situation had evolved into a classic Ponzi scheme. Interest payments on existing loans consumed a growing portion of the state budget, forcing the Ottomans to take out additional loans to service previous debts. By 1870, over 50% of revenue collected from the empire's subjects, peasants in Anatolia, fishermen in Greece, and artisans in Syria, was diverted abroad to service bonds held by European investors. This extraordinary extraction of capital left little for military, administrative, or infrastructural needs, further weakening the empire. Local financiers, primarily Greek and Armenian families based in Istanbul's Galata district, provided short-term loans at exorbitant rates when European funds were delayed, deepening the cycle of financial desperation. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 highlighted the empire's vulnerability. Lacking the financial resources to pay and equip its army adequately, the Ottoman forces suffered significant territorial losses in the Balkans and the Caucasus. The war concluded with the imposition of a massive Russian indemnity, further compounding the empire's debt. In 1875, facing the impossibility of meeting its obligations, the Ottoman government declared a partial moratorium on debt payments, cutting repayments to European bondholders in half. This default shocked international markets and provoked outrage in Britain and France, where middle-class investors had purchased Ottoman bonds for their high yields. The empire's financial weakness directly translated into geopolitical vulnerability, demonstrating the direct link between fiscal dependence and diminished sovereignty. In 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration (OPDA) was established. Formalizing European control over the empire's finances, this organization, run by a board of directors representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria, collected and managed the empire's most valuable revenue sources, including taxes on silk, salt, spirits, tobacco, and legal documents. The OPDA operated independently of the Sultan, employing over 5,000 tax collectors who enforced revenue collection with military-style discipline. While the administration was efficient and modern in accounting practices, its primary objective was to ensure repayment to foreign creditors, not to support Ottoman economic development. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA siphoned roughly one-third of the empire's total revenue, leaving the Ottoman government to operate with the remaining two-thirds. This extraction entrenched poverty, limited infrastructure investment, and constrained education and industrialization, creating a long-term underdevelopment trap. Germany's intervention in the late 19th and early 20th centuries added a new dimension to the empire's financial subjugation. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway, financed by Deutsche Bank, symbolized both modernization and exploitation. Contracts included kilometric guarantees, obligating the Ottoman government to pay guaranteed profits to German companies for every mile of track laid, regardless of the railway's commercial success. Moreover, rights to all oil and mineral resources within 20 kilometers of the tracks were ceded to German firms. While the project modernized transportation infrastructure and linked Europe to the Persian Gulf, it primarily served the strategic and economic interests of Germany, effectively turning the Ottoman Empire into a German economic colony. By 1910, German influence had displaced much of the British and French control, illustrating the empire's inability to maintain sovereignty even under shifting alliances. World War I presented the empire with an existential challenge. The Ottoman leadership, dominated by the Young Turk movement, allied with Germany in the hope of overturning British and French financial dominance. They believed that a German victory might cancel debts and allow the empire to regain control over its finances. In preparation, Ottoman authorities expelled British and French OPDA directors and halted payments to Europe. For a brief period, the empire experienced a semblance of financial independence. However, the war's outcome proved disastrous. Military defeat, territorial losses, and internal unrest, compounded by famine and disease, decimated the population. The empire was effectively dissolved by 1918, leaving a fragmented landscape of occupied territories and political instability. With the founding of the Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Ijo Arsen, the financial legacy of the Ottoman Empire persisted. European creditors demanded that the new state assume responsibility for Ottoman debts, arguing that Turkey had inherited both territory and obligation. Atatürk, pragmatic in his approach to international relations, accepted the debt to ensure Turkey's integration into the global economy and access to foreign investment. Although repayment terms were renegotiated and the burden eased relative to the original loans, the obligations remained, spanning the first 3 decades of the Republic's existence. The century-long repayment process concluded on May 25, 1954, marking the final settlement of debts incurred by Ottoman sultans a century earlier. The total span of payments underscores the long-term consequences of financial mismanagement and foreign control. Loans initially intended to resolve short-term fiscal crises evolved into instruments of external domination, shaping the political, social, and economic trajectory of both the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. The Ottoman debt trap also left lasting lessons for future states. It highlights the dangers of prioritizing prestige over productive investment, the importance of sustainable borrowing practices, and the centrality of fiscal sovereignty to national autonomy. Moreover, it demonstrates the broader implications of global finance in an interconnected world. External lenders can exert influence that shapes domestic policy, international alliances, and the trajectory of modernization. The Ottoman Empire's century-long struggle with debt serves as a cautionary tale of how financial mismanagement, compounded by predatory lending and structural vulnerability, can erode sovereignty, hinder development, and transform an empire into a debtor state for generations. I'm Alex, and this is History Behind Money. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.